Hello, everybody from the North Pole. We're starting a new unit. This new unit is on sentence structure. So let's go ahead and dive deep. There are four types of sentences. We have the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. You've probably heard these being discussed so far during our daily editing, but now we're really going to dive deep further into these topics. So first of all, let's talk about the simple sentence. A simple sentence has one independent clause. An independent clause is something that can stand alone as its own sentence. It's a complete thought, and it needs no help. It can stand alone. It's all by itself as an own sentence. So let's think of an example here. Claire is a VSCO girl. That is just one simple thought, and it can stand alone as its own sentence. Therefore, the independent clause is a simple sentence. Compound sentences have two independent clauses. So these are two independent thoughts, two thoughts that can stand alone as their own sentence, and they're going to be combined in several different ways in order to be a compound sentence. So just because you have two independent clauses doesn't mean you got it perfect. There's only certain ways this works in order for it to actually be a compound sentence. So first is with the fanboys. And if you remember, our fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So when we have a compound sentence, we're taking two independent clauses and we're adding a comma and a fanboys. So here is our sentence. Claire is a VSCO girl, but she has a fake hydro flask. What I need you to do, tell me which two independent clauses are here and what is our fanboys. So identify the first independent clause, identify the second independent clause, and then identify your fanboys. Perfect, you got it. Claire is a VSCO girl was your first independent clause. She has a fake hydro flask is your second independent clause. And then finally, but is your fanboys. Another way you can get a compound sentence is two independent clauses with a thamo. Not Thanos, don't get that confused. Thamo, Thamo, or thamo. So these stand for therefore, however, additionally, meanwhile, and otherwise. So when you see those in a sentence with two independent clauses and commas, you have another compound sentence. Here's an example. Claire is a VSCO girl. However, her sister doesn't even take selfies. So you'll see we need a semicolon and a comma here. So what I want to know, where is our independent clause number one? Where is our independent clause number two? And where is our thamo? Exactly. Claire is a VSCO girl, still our first independent clause. Her sister doesn't even take selfies. How dare her? That is our second independent clause. And then, however, is our thamo, the H in thamo. Lastly, you can just have two independent clauses brought together by just a semicolon, as long as they have something to do with each other, as long as they're somewhat related. So here we go. Claire's a VSCO girl. She always uses a filter in her pictures. So what I need you to do, what is our first independent clause and what is our second independent clause? And you got it. That one was pretty easy. You have your first independent clause, Claire is a VSCO girl. Second independent clause, she always uses a filter in her pictures. And if you notice, it's brought together by a semicolon. Now, you couldn't say something like, Claire is a VSCO girl, my dog ate his breakfast this morning. That wouldn't work. Although they're two independent clauses, a semicolon cannot hold them together as a compound sentence because they are unrelated. They have nothing to do with each other. Now we're going to talk about complex sentences. And you're noticing there's another cousin here. We have one independent clause that is a cousin of Santa Claus. And we have one dependent clause that is the other cousin of Santa Claus. These guys are brothers, but they're slightly different. So there's a little backstory here with Mr. Dependent Clause. You'll notice he's holding something in his hand because he can't stand alone as a sentence. So he used to work on a reindeer farm for Santa up in the North Pole, and he had a real bad accident. So what happened was he was feeding the reindeer one day, and they all just kind of bombarded him and just kind of took out one of his legs. And now he stands with what we call a comma cane, because that's what's going to help him stand up. We also can identify him with his SWABI. Since, when, while, after, although, as, before, because, if, even though. I feel like those you must have a song for because he's dancing for us. But here we have an example. When posting her pictures on social media, Claire always uses a filter. So, where is our dependent clause that cannot stand alone as its own sentence? And where is our independent clause that can stand alone as its own sentence? You got it. That SWABI there at the beginning of the sentence should have helped you identify the dependent clause. When is one of our SWABIs. Now notice his comma cane is there because he needs help standing. He can't stand alone at the beginning of a sentence. He can't stand alone at all as a sentence. But when he's at the beginning of a sentence, he's got to put a lot of weight on that comma cane or else he's going to fall over. And then you have it followed by your independent clause. Claire always uses a filter. Another way you can write a complex sentence is basically just flip-flopping the order. Now, in this case, you don't need his comma cane because he can lean on his brother to help him stay up. Claire always uses a filter when posting her pictures on social media. So again, identify them. What is the independent clause here? And what is the dependent clause? All right, there it is. Claire always uses a filter. That's your independent clause. Your SWABI is still when. It's sitting right there in the middle of the sentence. And then posting her pictures on social media. When posting her pictures on social media is your dependent clause. So notice there's no comma here. So when the dependent clause comes second, and remember, it's easier to identify them if you can find a SWABI at the beginning of that dependent clause. When they come second in the sentence, they don't need a comma because they can lean on their brother. It's only when they're at the beginning of the sentence is when they have trouble and they need their comma cane. So now, it might sound intimidating, but let's get through this. It's actually quite simple once you figure it out. We have compound complex sentences, and they're going to have two or more independent clauses and one dependent clause. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these examples. Since Claire was a VSCO girl, she wore scrunchies and she took selfies with filters. So as long as you're using the correct punctuation and all that stuff, it doesn't matter the order. But for the sake of this, I want you to identify where is our dependent, where are our independent clauses. All right, there you go. You got it. You will find your SWABI at the beginning of a sentence here with since. And that's going to identify your dependent clause. Since Claire was a VSCO girl. Notice the comma cane is right there after the word girl. Then you have your independent clause number 1, she wore scrunchies. And then your independent clause number 2, she took selfies with filters. And there is a fanboys bringing those two together. So those rules are still going to apply. We're just going to have all three dependent, independent, and independent clauses together in the same sentence. Now, like I said earlier, as long as you're following the rules of grammar, you can flip-flop those around in different orders. So, same clauses here, just in different order. Claire wore scrunchies, and she took selfies with filters since she was a VSCO girl. So go ahead, identify where are the two independent clauses at, and where is your dependent clause. All right, you're starting to catch on. There's pictures and colors to kind of help you here. The first independent clause, Claire wore scrunchies, followed by a comma and your fanboys to connect it to your independent clause. She took selfies with filters. And then a SWABI there to help identify that you have a dependent clause. Since is your SWABI. Since she was a VSCO girl is your dependent clause. And let's do one more here. Claire wore scrunchies, and since she was a VSCO girl, she took selfies with filters. Again, identify them. Where are your independent clauses and where is your dependent clause? You got it. They're still the same, so it should have been pretty simple. They're just in different orders, and they're still following those grammar rules. So Claire wore scrunchies is your first independent clause. You have a comma and a fanboys. To connect that to your dependent clause, notice the swabby there, since she was a VSCO girl, followed by a comma cane to help hold it up. She took selfies with filters is your independent clause. So I know you're probably drained. You're like, oh my goodness, that was a lot. Remember, you can always rewind and rewatch. If you need any help, make a private comment on your Google Classroom and let me know. But always stay hydrated. After a hard workout like that, working real hard, make sure you stay hydrated. And notice it's not a Hydro Flask. And I do want to point out, no reindeer were harmed in the making of this video.